20 minutes destroyed what 30 years of naval power could not protect. No warning, no grand battle line, no heroic last stand. Just silence, darkness, and a decision made too late. On October 23, 1944, Japan did not lose a fleet. It lost the belief that its war could still be controlled. 34 ships would vanish from the balance of power. More than 12,000 sailors would be removed from the future of the war, and none of it happened in the way Japan had prepared for. Here is the paradox history rarely explains. Japan did not collapse at sea because it lacked strength. It collapsed because it trusted a system that only worked if nothing went wrong. The Imperial Navy believed in one final truth, that wars were decided by decisive battles. That if enough ships arrived at the right place, at the right time with the right orders, the enemy could still be broken. Perfect coordination, unbroken command. And that belief turned 20 minutes into a catastrophe. The men who triggered it were not strategists in Tokyo. They were not admirals standing on bridges issuing grand orders. They were operators staring at flickering radar screens submerged in steel holes, making choices measured in seconds. When one command ship disappeared, something invisible vanished with it. Not fire, not numbers, control. What followed over the next 2 days looked like chaos. Battleships absorbing punishment they were never meant to survive. Small ships charging forces they were never meant to face. Orders issued, ignored, reversed. Every decision after that moment was made without a clear picture. Every movement carried uncertainty. Every commander acted with incomplete information, haunted by what had already gone wrong. Japan was still fighting. Its ships were still afloat. Its guns were still firing. This story is not about bravery saving the day. It is about how belief can become a weakness, how systems fail faster than armies, and how an empire did not lose its future in a climactic battle. It lost it in 20 minutes when control vanished and nothing afterward could put it back. If you want to understand how an empire lost control in just 20 minutes, and why everything after was inevitable, stay with this story. By October 1944, Japan was no longer fighting to win the war. It was fighting to preserve the belief that victory was still possible. On paper, the Imperial Japanese Navy remained formidable. Battleships still floated. Cruisers still steamed. The largest guns, Japan's fleet looked intact. But distance hid the truth. For 3 years, the Japanese Empire had been bleeding in ways that could not be repaired with courage or steel. Each island lost across the Pacific was not just territory surrendered. It was an airfield gone, a harbor denied, a supply route severed, and above all, it was time slipping away. Japan's problem was not manpower, it was fuel. Nearly 90% of Japan's petroleum came from the Dutch East Indies, thousands of miles from the home islands. Every ship that sailed, every aircraft that trained, every tank that moved depended on fuel that had to cross oceans, dominated increasingly by American submarines. By 1943, those submarines were no longer a nuisance. They were an extinction-level threat. Japanese merchant shipping losses doubled in a single year. Tankers burned faster than refineries could supply them. Crews trained with wooden propellers and simulated flight hours. Ships remained docked not because they were damaged. The Imperial Navy was starving. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commander of the combined fleet, understood the mathematics of collapse. At the current rate of fuel loss, Japan's surface navy would become immobile by mid-1945. A fleet that could not sail was not a fleet. It was only one way out. Not a campaign, not attrition, but a single decisive battle. The idea was not new. It had defined Japanese naval doctrine for decades, the belief that wars at sea were settled by one overwhelming clash, where superior spirit and concentrated force shattered the enemy in a moment of destiny. This belief had worked before, now it would have to work again. The plan was called Operation Shogo, Operation Victory. Its logic was brutally simple and dangerously fragile. American forces were landing in the Philippines, threatening Japan's last major supply routes. If that invasion forced a negotiated peace, not victory, survival. Everything depended on precision. Multiple fleets would converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions. Each group had a specific role. Timing was absolute. One delay, one misstep, one failure of communication would expose the entire plan, the northern force led by Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. But these carriers were no longer carriers in any meaningful sense. They had almost no aircraft, almost no trained pilots. They were ghosts. Their mission was sacrifice. They would act as bait, drawing Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet north, away from the landing beaches. If Halsey took the bait, the southern force would approach through narrow straits, forcing American defenders to split their attention, and then there was the center force. This was the hammer: 5 battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 15 destroyers, 70 ships in total, including Yamato and Musashi. This force carried enough firepower to annihilate the American landing fleet if it reached the beaches intact. Its commander was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, a veteran officer with 4 decades of service. Kurita understood the stakes. He understood that this was not a maneuver for advantage. It was a gamble against extinction. But Kurita also understood nothing could go wrong. Every fleet had to arrive on time. Every signal had to be received. Every order had to flow without interruption. The entire plan rested on command continuity. Kurita chose his flagship accordingly, not the largest ship, not the most heavily armored. He chose Atago, a heavy cruiser equipped with the most advanced communication and coordination systems in the fleet. Atago was not just a warship. It was a floating command center, the brain of the operation. From Atago's bridge, Kurita could see, hear, and control the movement of dozens of ships across hundreds of miles of ocean. Orders flowed through her radios. Decisions were processed through her plotting rooms. Without Atago, the center force would still have guns, but it would not have coherence. On October 22, 1944, the center force assembled at Brunei Bay. Kurita watched as battleships, cruisers, and destroyers gathered into formation. It was the greatest concentration of Japanese naval power remaining on Earth. To many of the men aboard those ships, it felt like a final stand, a chance to reverse everything that had gone wrong. What they did not know was that the moment had already begun to slip away. The American Navy did not need to defeat the center force in a traditional battle. It did not need to outgun Yamato or outnumber Kurita's ships. It only needed to see them. And seeing them first would be enough. For weeks, American submarines had been patrolling the narrow passages leading from the South China Sea into the Philippine waters. These choke points were predictable. Massive fleets could not slip through unnoticed. Not anymore. Submarine warfare had changed the rules. No longer were submarine warfare. By 1944, they were the eyes of the fleet. Silent observers capable of stripping secrecy from even the most ambitious plans. The Japanese understood this threat in theory. They underestimated in practice. Kurita believed speed and discipline would carry his force through before American commanders could react. He believed his fleet could remain unseen long enough to preserve surprise. That belief was the final assumption Operation Shogo could not afford, because the moment secrecy vanished, the entire structure of the plan would collapse, not gradually, not over days, but instantly. And the men who would shatter that secrecy were already waiting beneath the surface, unaware that the fate of an empire was about to pass across their radar screens. In war, surprise is not an advantage. It is a requirement. Operation Shogo could survive delays. It could survive losses. It could even survive confusion. But it could not survive being seen in the early hours of October 23, 1944. The waters of the Palawan Passage were calm, narrow, predictable, and unavoidable. The passage funneled Japan's center force toward the Philippine Sea like a gate that could not be bypassed. Kurita's fleet entered in disciplined formation. Destroyers screened ahead, cruisers followed, battleships held the center, their massive hulls slicing through the darkness. From the bridge of Atago, Kurita believed the most dangerous part of the journey was already behind him. He was wrong. Beneath the surface, 2 American submarines had been waiting for weeks. Astarter and Dace were not elite strike weapons by design. They were patrol submarines assigned to observe, report, and survive. Their primary mission was not to attack major fleet units head-on. Naval doctrine was clear on this point. Submarines shadowed fleets. They reported positions. They let surface forces and aircraft deliver the killing blows. What they were not supposed to do was attack the core of a battle fleet directly at 1:16 am. The radar operator aboard Darter saw the first contact, then another, then dozens more. The screen filled with returns so dense they blurred into one another. This was not a convoy. This was not a screening group. It was a fleet commander. David McClintock, Darter's captain, raised the periscope. What he saw did not resemble any target profile taught in training manuals. Masts stretched across the horizon. Dark shapes filled the sea from edge to edge. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, the entire Japanese center force. Exposed and compressed by the geography, he could do what submarines were meant to do: transmit a report, shadow the fleet, withdraw into silence, or he could attack something 200 times his displacement, armed with guns that could obliterate him in seconds if detected. McClintock did both. He sent a brief, encrypted contact report to Admiral Halsey's headquarters. No analysis. Enemy fleet sighted. Course, speed, composition. With that message, Japan lost its last secret. Operation Shore depended on surprise more than fiery. The moment that transmission was received, American commanders knew where Kurita was, where he was heading, and roughly when he would arrive. Instead of withdrawing, he ordered Darter and Dace to sprint ahead of the Japanese formation on the surface, using darkness and speed to reach an ambush position. For 4 hours, the two submarines raced through the night. Diesel engines roared, bow waves sprayed across their decks. Japanese destroyers scanned the horizon with radar and binoculars, searching outward. They never looked down. By dawn, Darter and Dace submerged ahead of the oncoming fleet. They waited at periscope depth as the Japanese ships advanced in parade formation, unaware that the most dangerous moment of the operation had already arrived. At the head of the formation sailed Atao. McClintock did not know she was Kurita's flagship. He did not know she carried the nerve center of Operation Shore. He saw only the largest, most valuable target within range. That was enough. At a range of less than 1,000 yards, McClintock ordered a full spread of torpedoes in the forward torpedo room. Operators moved without drama. These were men trained to treat destruction as a technical problem. Calculations were checked, gyros set, firing solutions confirmed. Then the orders came. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4, Fire 5, 6. 6 Mar 14 torpedoes shrieked toward Atago at nearly 50 knots. Inside the submarine, men counted seconds in silence. The first explosion shattered Atago's starboard side below the bridge. Boiler rooms erupted in steam and firepower failed instantly. Kurita was thrown off his feet before damage control teams could react. The second torpedo struck, then the third, then the fourth. 4 hits in less than half a minute. Steam lines burst scalding compartments. Fire spread into ammunition spaces. The ship began to list violently. Kurita ration lines went dead one by one. Kurita attempted to reach the command center. Passageways were blocked. The bridge was cut off from engineering. Radios fell silent. The brain of the operation was burning. As Atago died, Dace attacked next Commander Bladen. Claggett lined up the heavy crews. Maya disappeared beneath the surface in minutes. In less than 20 minutes, 2 heavy cruisers were destroyed. One of them carried the entire command structure of Japan's most ambitious naval operation. At 5:53 am, Atago capsized and sank. Over 300 sailors went down with her. Kurita survived, pulled from the oil-covered water by a destroyer. For hours afterward, the center force drifted in confusion. Orders could not be issued clearly. Signals were relayed through secondary ships with limited coordinate capability. Timing slipped. The fleet still existed. The ships were still intact, but the system that bound them together was gone. This was the paradox of modern naval warfare. Firepower could survive catastrophic loss. Command could not. Kurita eventually transferred his flag to Yamato, but the damage was already done. 6 critical hours were lost. The precise timing Operation Shore required began to unravel. Destroyers searched for survivors. Battleships altered course. The center force continued toward the Philippine Sea, but it no longer moved as a single organism. It moved as a collection of wounded parts, and every decision Kurita made afterward would be shaped by what had just happened: the burning oil, the sudden darkness, the realization that the enemy had seen him first. Palawan was not the largest engagement of the battle. It was not the bloodiest. It did not decide the war by itself, but it destroyed something far more important than ships. It destroyed certainty. From that moment on, Japan's last offensive would unfold without clarity, without synchronization, and without the confidence that had once defined its naval doctrine. Everything that followed at the Sibuyan Sea and off Samar would be fought in the shadow of those 20 minutes. Because wars are not lost when the last ship sinks, they are lost when control disappears. After Palawan, the Japanese center force was still alive, but it was no longer synchronized. From the outside, nothing looked catastrophic. The battleships continued forward, cruisers maintained formation, destroyers screened the perimeter. To an observer who did not know what had been lost, the fleet still appeared dangerous. That illusion was deadly. It destroyed tempo. Operation Shogo required the center force to arrive at Lake Gulf at a precise moment, coordinated with diversionary attacks from the north and south. Every hour mattered. Every delay compounded risk. And after Otago sank, time began slipping away in increments too small to notice, but too large to recover. Kurita eventually re-established command from Yamato, but Yamato was not built to be a command ship. She was built to absorb punishment and deliver it. Her communications were powerful, but not routine for coordinating 70 ships scattered across miles of ocean. Orders that once flowed instantly now arrived late or incomplete. Signals were relayed, repeated, misinterpreted. Cruiser formations adjusted without clarity. The center force was still moving, but it was no longer moving as one. Meanwhile, American commanders were not guessing anymore. The submarine contact report sent before the torpedoes struck had already reached Admiral Halsey. By the time Kurita struggled to restore command, American carriers' strike plans were being drawn. Palawan had given the Americans something priceless: time to prepare. By dawn on October 24th, Kurita's fleet entered the Sibuyan Sea. Geographically, it was a trap, a confined body of water surrounded by islands that hosted American airfields and carrier groups operating just beyond the horizon. The plan assumed speed would carry him through before American air power could concentrate. That assumption no longer held. At 8:12 am, radar operators aboard American carrier detected the Japanese fleet. Task Force 38, under Admiral Market Mitcher, had been searching for Kurita since receiving the submarine report. What followed was not a single decisive strike. It was attrition by design. The first wave of American aircraft reached the center force mid-morning. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes. They did not need to destroy the fleet outright. They needed to slow it, to damage it, to force maneuvering the terminate. She was not chosen because she was vulnerable. She was chosen because she was unavoidable. At over 70,000 tons fully loaded, Musashi was the largest warship ever constructed. Her armor was measured in feet, not inches. Her guns could hurl shells heavier than automobiles across miles of ocean. To Japanese planners, she embodied the belief that battleships could still dominate the sea. And in the early moments of the attack, that belief seemed justified. The first torpedo struck Musashi's starboard side. Damage control teams responded calmly. Floating was common with the formation. To observers aboard other ships, it looked manageable. That perception was dangerous. The American attack was not designed to sink Musashi quickly. It was designed to exhaust her ability to recover. Wave after wave arrived throughout the day. Each strike forced Musashi to maneuver, to counter flood, to sacrifice internal carver. By midday, she began to lag behind. Kurita faced a choice no Japanese admiral wanted to make. He could slow the entire fleet to protect Musashi, or he could abandon her to preserve momentum. He chose momentum. This decision is often framed as tactical necessity, but in reality it was the consequence of Palawan. Kurita no longer had the time buffer Operation Shogo required. The hours lost replacing his flagship could not be regained. Protecting Musashi meant arriving late, possibly too late to strike the American landing force. American pilots understood immediately what that meant. Once isolated, she became a focus of sustained attack. Torpedoes struck her port side, bombs penetrated her deck, fires spread, flooding, cascaded, damage, control. Teams worked with discipline. By late afternoon, Musashi was no longer a battleship. She was a slowing mass of steel-absorbing punishment so the rest of the fleet could continue at 7:35 p.m. She capsized and sank over 1,000 sailors. It appeared to be a decisive American victory, the sinking of the mightiest battleship ever built, proof that air power had surpassed armor. But in the context of the larger operation, Musashi's death was something else. It was confirmation that the center force had lost its margin for error. Kurita still had 4 battleships, he still had cruisers, he still had destroyers. But he had lost another critical resource. Confidence. He had watched his greatest battleship die slowly, helpless against forces she could not reach. The center force continued toward the San Bernardino Strait that night, battered but intact. Kurita believed the worst was over. American pilots believed they had broken the Japanese advance. Both assumptions were wrong. Because while American aircraft returned to their carriers, Kurita pressed forward under cover of darkness. His fleet passed through the San Bernardino Strait unopposed. No American surface forces guarded it. Admiral Halsey had taken the bait, convinced that Japan's carrier force to the north represented the primary threat. Halsey turned his entire Third Fleet away from the strait to pursue Ozawa's decoys. This decision has been debated for decades. Was it a mistake? Was it reasonable based on the information available? What matters is not the answer. Had Kurita arrived earlier, coordinated perfectly with full command cohesion, Halsey's choice might have led to disaster for the American landing force. But Kurita did not arrive as planned. He arrived late, he arrived damaged, and he arrived psychologically altered by what he had already lost. When dawn broke on October 25th, Kurita's fleet emerged off Samar and encountered a force never meant to face battleships. Escort carriers, destroyers, destroyer escorts. Taffy 3, what happened next would be remembered as one of the most improbable confrontations in naval history. But it is critical to understand this. Samar was not where Japan lost the war. It was where the consequences of Palawan became impossible to escape. Kurita was no longer executing a plan. He was reacting to trauma. Every order he issued that morning was shaped by uncertainty. Every report he received was filtered to the memory of surprise. The system that was meant to deliver Japan's final blow had already failed. It was only now revealing the cost. At dawn on October 25, 1944, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita believed he had succeeded. His fleet had survived the Sibuyan Sea. It had passed through the San Bernardino Strait unopposed. Ahead lay the American landing force at Leyte, exposed and unguarded. For the first time since Palawan, then the silhouettes appeared on the horizon. They were wrong. Not battleships, not fleet carriers, not the concentrated strength Kurita had expected to face. They were escort carriers, small, slow, lightly armored ships built on merchant hulls. Alongside them, a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts. Taffy 3, on paper, this should have been annihilation. Kurita commanded 4 battleships, including Yamato, whose guns could destroy any ship in Taffy 3 at ranges. Beyond retaliation, he had heavy cruisers, fast destroyers, and overwhelming numerals written before the war, pointed to the same conclusion. The American force should retreat. If it could not retreat, it should be destroyed. What Kurita saw instead defied expectation. American aircraft began launching immediately. Some carried bombs, some carried depth charges meant for submarines, some carried nothing at all. Pilots flew repeated attack runs regardless formation, and scatter. Destroyers turned toward Kurita's fleet and accelerated. They were not screening, they were attacking. From Kurita's bridge, reports arrived in fragments. Torpedoes in the water, ships maneuvering violently, cruisers forced to alter course to avoid perceived threats, smoke screens obscuring visibility. The battlefield became confusion. Kurita struggled to understand what he was facing. His experience told him no rational commander would throw escort carriers and destroyers against battleships. Yet that was exactly what was happening to Japanese lookouts. The American attacks felt relentless aircraft fire. Destroyers closed to torpedo range. Explosions erupted across the formation, some real, some imagined. This was not a battle Japan had planned for. Kurita had trained for decisive fleet engagements. He had trained to trade blows with equals. He had not trained to fight an enemy who refused to behave logically. And beneath every report lay a deeper problem. Kurita no longer trusted what he was seeing at Palawan. At the Sibuyan Sea, air power had erased his margin for error. Now at Samar, uncertainty ruled everything. Were these truly escort carriers? Was Halsey closer than expected? Were heavier American forces just beyond the horizon? The Japanese fleet's greatest weakness was no longer fuel or fire. It was information. Each time Kurita attempted to concentrate his force, new threats appeared. Torpedoes were reported. Aircraft attacked from multiple directions. Smoke obscured targets. Ships collided or narrowly avoided one another. What should have been a simple surface engagement became a series of disconnected actions. They charged directly at Japanese cruisers and battleships, launching torpedoes at extreme ranges, forcing Kurita's ships to maneuver defensively. Even when torpedoes missed, the threat they represented was enough for combat. The possibility of a torpedo is often more disruptive than the weapon itself. Kurita watched his formation unravel. Cruisers fell out of line. Battleships turned independently. Destroyers acted on partial orders. He was no longer commanding a coherent force. He was managing a crisis from the American perspective. The battle was remembered as a miracle of courage, destroyers charging battleships. But from Kurita's perspective, it was something else entirely. It was déjà vu. Once again, his fleet was reacting rather than controlling events. Once again, unseen threats shaped his decisions. Once again, the enemy refused to fight on terms Japan understood. And beneath it all lay a question Kurita could not escape. What was he actually facing? If these were merely escort carriers, then destroying them would clear the path to the landing beaches. But if they were a screen, then pressing forward risked exposing his fleet to encirclement and destruction by unseen forces. Kurita had already watched certainty fail him twice. Atago had sunk because he did not see the submarines. Musashi had died because air power arrived sooner than expected. Now he faced a third uncertainty. He had lost faith in assumptions. Reports continued to arrive. Japanese ships were taking damage. American aircraft continued to attack. Smoke and confusion made it simple. Reach Leyte and destroy the invasion fleet. But that goal assumed control. At Samar, control no longer existed. At 9:11 am, Kurita made a decision that stunned his staff. He ordered the center force to disengage. Not a retreat in panic, not a rout of withdrawal. The order rippled through the fleet. Ships turned north. Guns fell silent. The American force, battered and shocked, watched in disbelief as the Japanese fleet pulled away. In purely tactical terms, Kurita still had the power to inflict catastrophic damage. He could have pressed the attack. He could have destroyed the escort carriers. But Kurita was no longer making a tactical calculation. He had seen too much the unexpected attacks, the refusal of the enemy to behave rationally. The cost already paid for assumptions that failed. Kurita understood something few historians were willing to accept. Victory was no longer measurable. Even if he reached the beaches, even if he destroyed the invasion force, the pattern would repeat. More ships willing to fight without regard for survival. The system Japan relied on could not withstand that kind of enemy, so he turned away. The battle off Samar ended not because Japan ran out of weapons, but because it ran out of belief. Belief that control could be restored. Belief that decisive victory was still possible. Belief that the future could be shaped by one final blow. When Kurita ordered his fleet to withdraw, the outcome of the Pacific War was sealed. Not by defeat in battle, but by the realization that the war Japan believed it was fighting no longer existed. And that realization began 20 minutes at Palawan. When the guns fell silent off Samar, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was not yet over. Ships still floated, men were still fighting, orders were still being issued across the Pacific. But something irreversible had already happened. Japan's navy was no longer a tool of strategy. It had become a memory of one. The numbers alone told part of the story. By the end of the battle, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and over 12,000 sailors. What remained was a force unable to challenge American sea control again. Yet focusing only on losses misses the deeper consequence. Leyte Gulf did not destroy Japan's navy by fury alone. It destroyed the belief system that had created it for decades. Japanese naval doctrine had revolved around a single idea: the decisive battle, the belief that war at sea could be resolved by one perfectly executed concentration of force, overcame material disadvantage. That belief shaped ship design. It shaped training. It shaped command culture. It also created fragility. Operation Shogo is not reckless. It was logical within that belief system. If one final blow could restore strategic balance, then every remaining assault was the flaw at the center of that logic. Modern warfare did not reward perfect plans. It punished them. The moment Atago sank, Japan's final offensive did not fail gradually. It lost coherence instantly. Every subsequent event from the Sibuyan Sea to Samar flowed from that loss of control. Musashi did not die because she was poorly designed. She died because air power denied her the conditions she was built for. Taffy 3 did not survive because it was stronger. It survived because it fought in ways the Japanese system could not predict or absorb. And Kurita did not turn away because he lacked courage. He turned away because he recognized that the rules he had trained under no longer applied. In that moment, he faced a truth no commander wants to confront. There are enemies you cannot defeat by destroying their equipment, only by outlasting their system. The United States Navy had not merely built ships, it had built redundancy. Submarines, carriers, surface forces, and decentralized command structures overlapped and compensated for one another. Losing one element did not paralyze the whole. Japan had built a masterpiece of coordination, and masterpieces shatter when struck in the wrong place. After Leyte Gulf, its remaining ships were trapped by fuel shortages and American sea control. Battleships that once symbolized national pride became stationary anti-aircraft platforms, or were sunk without ever firing their main guns again. The age of the battleship ended not with a final duel, but with a realization. Control mattered more than armor, and timing mattered more than courage. The lessons of Leyte Gulf reshaped naval warfare for generations. Submarines became instruments of strategic disruption, not just commerce raiders. Aircraft carriers replaced battleships as the core of naval power. But beyond doctrine and technology, Leyte Gulf left a human legacy that endured far longer. The men who fought there carried its memory for the rest of their lives. American sailors remembered the fear of facing battleships with ships never designed for that role. Japanese sailors remembered the shock of realizing that everything they had trained for no longer guaranteed survival. And Kurita carried something else. He carried the knowledge that wars are not always lost at the moment of retreat. Sometimes they are lost much earlier when assumptions go unchallenged. When historians ask why Japan lost the Pacific War, they often point to industrial capacity, resources, and numbers. All of that mattered, but Leyte Gulf revealed a quieter truth. Empires do not fall when they run out of ships. They fall when their systems can no longer adapt. 20 minutes at Palawan did not sink an empire by themselves. They exposed one that could no longer recover. And once that exposure occurred, everything that followed was inevitable. Not because Japan stopped fighting, but because it was fighting a war that no longer existed. That is why Leyte Gulf matters, not as a story of heroism or tragedy alone, but as a warning written into history that certainty is dangerous, and that the moment a system loses its ability to adapt, defeat is already in motion, even if the guns have not yet fallen silent. If this story changed how you see World War II, share it with someone who believes wars are decided only by fury, Subscribe for more stories where history is not just remembered, but understood.